I don't know about this sound system. You guys are in for a treat tonight. I think probably one of the most shocking things I tell people is that one of my mentors is my son. That's probably the highest compliment I could pay him. I am aware of how much time and effort he's put in this presentation, and you guys are in for a treat. It's going to run about 2 hours, so we're going to take a couple of short breaks in it. If you have to leave before it's over with, it will be posted on YouTube when it's over, and you can go back and catch the rest of it. I would encourage you to catch all of it because it all comes together at the end. With that, I will bring Shay Layton.
Hey guys, so I'm going to get started. What I'm not here to do is speak about how to reach millennials, that might come out as a consequence of this talk. What I want to do is challenge us all to step back from some of the habits we have in how we think about government, politics, and society, and how we talk to other people about them. I'm going to cover some recent psychological research in parts 1 and 2, and 5, and some of my own political analysis in parts 3 and 4. And finally, part 6 will bring it all together with practical advice in hopes that we can find the best way to have a peaceful, respectful, and free society. I'll be throwing around a lot of words like liberal and conservative, left and right, but I want to make sure it's clear that these words are useful oversimplifications, meaning they help me say what I'm trying to say, but people are a lot more complicated than 2 categories like that. My hope in giving this talk is that no matter what political view you have, you walk away a little bit uncomfortable and challenged, a little bit affirmed and validated, and overall hopeful. First off, I want to tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up mainly here in the Spokane area and was raised in a conservative family where I learned about America, the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, and liberty. But after completing high school, the worst happened. I moved to Portland to go to college. I specifically went to Portland to attend a Bible college and get a youth ministry degree, but I soon realized my love for psychology, and I ended up with a psych degree instead. While attending Bible college, I noticed that even there, people varied in their political views from the far right to the far left and everything in between. So I heard all sorts of perspectives and arguments on a variety of social issues. After 4 years of these varied encounters at the Bible college, I graduated and spent 4 more years in Portland getting to know the locals and hearing their stories. Many of my closest friends were feminists, LGBTQIAPK, and everything else I was warned about. What I found was that many of them were sincere, kind truth seekers, and their stories of pain and hurt were true, and they were serious. But the conservatives I had grown up around often did gloss over these stories with the label agenda, gay agenda, liberal agenda, etc. However, every so often I would come back to Spokane, and I'd be reminded that the Constitution is an incredibly wise way of protecting people from some of the greatest forms of oppression and abuse that have occurred throughout history. And then I would go back to Portland and hear grievous social sufferings that some of the right wouldn't talk about. Yet the left didn't seem to understand what history had shown to be the means by which the greatest social injustices and massacres had happened. I was bothered because each side minimized, ignored, or invalidated the concerns of the other side. It dawned on me that the main differences in political views I was hearing were not that we didn't share similar values, but that we had different solutions to the problems we saw, and we prioritized which problems were most important differently. And yet the base desire to see people protected, to respect people's liberty, and to preserve human dignity were all there. I did door-to-door sales for about 6 months, and during that time, something very influential to my view of politics happened. One of the basics of sales is simply trying to connect with the customer over something they care about. As I approached one particular suburban home, I saw the American flag and other patriotic decorations and thought to myself, this will be a productive conversation even if I don't sell anything. Instead, I was greeted with yelling about my property, my rights, and general threats to my well-being, even before I'd said a word. I'd been told all my life that liberals were entitled, but this man had the same spirit, simply being entitled to property and guns instead of education and food. On the other hand, many of the entitled liberals I knew had no interest in using welfare programs for themselves, but saw the poor and hungry around them and were grieved by their suffering. I had views more aligned to this entitled patriot, but I'd far prefer to be around the social justice warriors I'd befriended. In general, I found it strange that when I would listen to descriptions of one political side from the other, it was as if there was no good in them whatsoever. Liberals were entitled to food and education, didn't care about human life because of abortion, and wanted oppressive government. Conservatives were entitled to guns and private property, didn't care about human life because of war and immigration policies, and wanted oppressive males and oppressive businesses. I heard conservatives complain about disrespectful talk from young people because it wasn't correct by their standards, and liberals complain about disrespectful talk from white people because it wasn't politically correct. On the right, I watched conservatives condemn Bill Clinton's promiscuity and then rationalize Donald Trump's locker room talk, and I saw them fight zealously to preserve human life from abortion, but then reject any socialist welfare programs to preserve the lives of babies after they were born. As one of my friends said to me, it didn't seem like anyone was actually pro-life. On the left, I saw videos of Hillary Clinton changing her stance on homosexual marriage every handful of years, while people continued to stick her campaign sticker next to gay pride flags on their car bumpers. And I just recently saw her sticker next to an anti-war sticker while she actively campaigned on war with Russia. Obama campaigned on ending the war in Iraq, and in 2016, he dropped 12,000 bombs on them. All this to say, when I encountered members of these political groups firsthand, I saw sincerity and valid concerns, and yet from the bigger picture, both sides looked outright insane. From all these experiences, it started to seem as though we talk right past each other, unable to comprehend in the slightest that the people we are talking with might be just as human as we are, and the issues we are discussing might potentially be more complicated than we believe. I set out to do some research on what was happening and why. While we need to discuss policy, priorities, and what we think is true, we are human beings, and the function of our minds and hearts as humans will always play a significant role in what we think is the right choice, and how we view other people and their different choices. If we want to change our society as a nation ruled by we the people, then we have to actually reach individual people. To do that, we have to understand them, and we have to understand ourselves. There's a lot of recent psychology that flips past beliefs about human thinking completely on their head, and I think these have serious implications for how we think about and discuss politics. Rather than just talk about the conclusions, I'm going to walk you through some of the experiments. In a way, I'm defining the words I want to use for the rest of my talk, but I'm doing it by giving you experiences rather than simply using other words, sort of like helping you understand music by playing music for you. I'll be drawing from two books in particular. One is a general psychology book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and the other is a political psychology book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. I'll be using a variety of quotes from them, but for anyone familiar with their terminology, I'm swapping out a lot of their terms and editing the quotes heavily to make it easy for you to follow. So for our first experiment, all I want you to do is read the two words on the screen a couple times. Daniel Kahneman says, "A lot likely happened to you during the last second or two. You may have experienced some unpleasant images and memories, your face likely twisted slightly in an expression of disgust, and you may have tried to look away. Your heart rate increased, and the hair on your arms rose a little, and your sweat glands may have been activated. In short, you responded to the disgusting word with an attenuated version of how you would react to the actual event. All of this was completely automatic, beyond your control. Bananas, vomit. For our second experiment, I want you to look at the eyes on the screen, and then they will change. Kahneman notes, your heartbeat may have accelerated when you looked at the figure. In studies, it accelerated even before people could label what was so eerie about the picture. After some time, they recognized the eyes of a terrified person. And for our third experiment, I just want you to read the sentence on the screen. Earth revolves around the trouble every year. Kahneman notes a distinctive pattern was detected in brain activity starting within 0.2 of a second of the onset of the odd word. Even more remarkable, the same brain response occurs at the same speed when a male voice says, "I believe I'm pregnant because I feel sick every morning," or when an upper-class voice says, "I have a large tattoo on my back." What I've just introduced you to is the intuitive part of your brain. This is what you rely on a majority of the time you're conscious, and it uses very little energy or effort. When you walk down the street and know that what you're seeing is faces, trees, cars, roads, etc., it's the subconscious intuitive part of your brain that's interpreting and providing information so you can use minimal energy to function and focus on other tasks like looking for the specific storefront you wanted to visit. Kahneman notes that the intuitive mind's job is to maintain and update a model of your personal world. So you have a model of what you think is normal inside of your head. It does this by noticing what events, feelings, and more tend to happen together. And from this information, it determines your interpretation of the present as well as your expectations for the future. What happens with your intuition happens instantly. As Kahneman notes, your brain is on a hair trigger. The other part of our thought life that we need to discuss is the analytical part of the brain, as opposed to the intuitive part. When the intuitive part notices that there is a problem that it can't deal with, it triggers the analytical part. The analytical mind deals with slow, conscious calculation, where you're really putting all your energy into what you're thinking about. Thus, when you're walking down the street and you hear screaming, this unexpected event tells your intuition that this is not normal. And it causes you to start putting distinct effort into deciding what should be done using your analytical mind. For our fourth experiment, many of you have probably seen this before. This is the Mueller-Lyer illusion. So the lines look to be different lengths. But the thing is when they're measured, they're exactly the same length. Your intuitive brain sees differences in these lines because of the way it interprets shapes. But the thing is you can know these lines are the same length with your analytical mind, and your intuitive brain continues to interpret. So at the same time, your intuitive mind is telling you what's going on here, and your analytical mind knows it's something else. Your intuitive brain uses rules it has built in to tell you about the relationship of the lines, whereas the analytical part of the brain can learn that this intuitive reaction is not reflective of reality. However, your brain is still interpreting intuitively even while you know what you're seeing is not accurate. You can know something you are feeling doesn't reflect reality, and even then, it still affects you. Rationality and knowledge are not enough to conquer the messages your intuitive mind is sending you. We like to credit a lot of our thought to the analytical mind, but in reality, most of what we think and believe is intuitive. Much of what we say is logical is actually just consistent with the other things we believe. So for my last experiment, I'm going to have you read this. I'll explain it first. I'm going to have you read a story math problem on the screen. Do your best to come up with an answer to it. If you don't, that's fine. And I'm actually going to ask for people to just raise their hands based on what answer they got. So here is the math problem. I'll read it. If a baseball bat and a baseball cost $1.10 together, and the baseball bat costs $1 more than the baseball, how much does the baseball cost? So, if you think the answer is 10 cents, would you raise your hand? If you got 10 cents as the answer, would you raise your hand? Okay. If you got the answer 5 cents, or at least no, it can't be 10 cents. It's definitely not 10 cents. Would you raise your hand? Okay, so a handful of people figured out that it's 5 cents. That is the correct answer. The baseball costs 5 cents because the baseball bat costs $1.05, since it has to cost $1 more than the baseball. If you didn't follow that, that's totally okay. But I want to ask the handful of people that got 5 cents as the correct answer, when you first heard the problem, would you raise your hand if 10 cents popped into your head? So the important thing is to note is that as soon as you looked at the question, many people, 10 cents immediately pops into your head. You can stop and go, you know what, I don't think this is right. He might be giving me a trick question, or for whatever reason, you might have questioned it. You may have noticed off the bat that the word more was there. But most people, even when they got the right answer, the 10 cents answer popped into their head immediately, even before they did the critical thinking. So the intuition thinks it can solve the problem, and it throws out 10 cents as a potential answer. However, a person can activate the analytical part of the brain and potentially solve the problem. The reason why I showed you this is that even in mathematics, which is a very rationality-oriented subject, it's not always done as a part of our logical analytical process. Many of the things we think are logical are rooted simply in subconscious impulses, and we don't even question them. Another area, and one of the most important for our talk, now that we've defined our terms, is moral values. We often think or explain our moral values as rational or obvious, but many of the things our brain immediately feels are wrong. But many of the things our brain immediately feels are wrong, we actually struggle to explain. In one experiment, several atheists were asked to sign a piece of paper which said, "I blank hereby sell my soul after death to the interviewer for the sum of $2. This form is part of a psychology experiment. It is not legal or binding contract in any way. The interviewer told them they could rip up this piece of paper, selling their soul, after they signed it, and they'd still get their $2. The problem is most of them still refused. And they noted that they didn't believe in souls, but they still felt completely uncomfortable signing it. Sorry, I lost a slide here. Here we go. In another experiment, people were asked to take a sip of a glass of apple juice. Then sterilized, laboratory-raised cockroaches were brought in and were briefly dipped into the apple juice. Surprising to me, about a third of the people were willing to drink the apple juice, but the other 2/3 refused, even knowing that there was absolutely nothing unsafe about drinking this juice. My point is that what repulses us and produces the impulses which often guide our decisions are much like these experiments, being illogical and yet compelling us nonetheless. I'm not saying these impulses are wrong either, though I suspect some are. But here's some I agree with, even though I can't explain them. We don't harvest organs from dead people without their previous permission. Someone might point out that the person is dead and won't be using them, and someone out there may be saved by taking those organs, yet most of us still won't do it. Another example is that we would feel very uncomfortable spitting on a picture of a loved one or of Jesus. Someone might point out that it's not the actual person, and they may never see it happen, so they won't be offended. It might even be the person in the picture asking you, "Spit on this picture of me." And yet, most of us would feel very uncomfortable and would probably say, "No, thank you." We even avoid saying certain words because they are bad. When I've asked people why a word is a swear word, the most often response is because it has a dirty meaning. Of course, the word for female dog has a perfectly fine meaning, yet it would send a negative reaction across most of the people here simply if I said it, which I won't. On the other hand, I told my mom that when a person shares with me a painful experience they're going through, I'll often say sympathetically, "Ah, that sucks." And I asked her if that was okay. she said it was, but the problem is it comes from a very inappropriate reference that's not hard to pick up when you kick in your analytical brain and think about it. What I want to illustrate is that even without rational explanation, we have forces guiding what we will and won't do. They're guiding us both with metaphysical issues like risking the selling of our soul that we don't believe in, and with physical issues like drinking an entirely safe cockroach juice. What many studies have found is that when asked if certain things are right or wrong, people will usually answer immediately. Yet when they are asked why they feel the way they do, it often takes great effort for them to come up with an answer. Yet many of the issues vary greatly from person to person that we feel this way about, and some of what stirs us changes as time goes on. Jonathan Haidt concludes that moral intuitions arise automatically and almost instantaneously, long before moral reasoning has a chance to get started. And those first intuitions tend to drive our later reasoning. What ends up happening is that we feel an intuitive impulse of what is right or wrong with our intuition. And then we use our analytical mind to find a reason why that intuition makes rational sense, like a sort of public relations tool. Haidt says we do moral reasoning not to reconstruct the actual reasons why we ourselves came to a judgment. We reason to find the best possible reasons why someone else ought to join us in our judgment. The question is, why? First off, we don't like using the analytical mind. Several studies have found that glucose is actually depleted when doing complex mental work, like complicated math problems, similar to the glucose depletion of someone exercising. And when people were given an intake of healthy sugars, such as from a glass of juice, they could maintain their efficiency at performing complex tasks with the mind. Like in most circumstances, humans prefer to be comfortable. And as Kahneman said, people apparently find cognitive effort at least mildly unpleasant and avoid it as much as possible. However, he also points out that, as a way to live your life, continuous vigilance is not necessarily good, and it is certainly impractical. Constantly questioning our own thinking and intuition would be impossibly tedious, and the analytical mind is much too slow and inefficient to serve as a substitute for the intuitive mind in making routine decisions. While we dislike using our analytical mind for a variety of reasons, the reason we use it so often to justify our intuitions is because of what is going on in the intuitive subconscious. Kahneman notes that the intuitive mind excels at constructing the best possible story that incorporates ideas currently activated, but it does not and cannot allow for information it does not have. The measure of success for the subconscious intuition is the coherence of the story it manages to create. So your mind takes all the experiences you've had and it tries to construct a single story that explains all of it. When information is scarce, which is a common occurrence, the intuitive subconscious operates as a machine for jumping to conclusions. Consider the following. Will Sarah be a good leader? She is intelligent and strong. Yeah, probably. An answer quickly came to your mind, which was likely yes. You picked the best answer based on the very limited information available, but you jumped the gun. What if the next two adjectives after intelligent and strong were corrupt and cruel, which it's very possible those things coexist? The confidence that individuals have in their beliefs depends mostly on the quality of story they can tell about what they see, even if they see little. We often fail to allow for the possibility that evidence that should be critical to our judgment or reasoning is missing. According to the subconscious, what we see in front of us at the time is all that exists. Participants in a well-known experiment were given a choice of drawing a marble from one of two urns, in which red marbles would win a prize. Urn A contains 10 marbles, one of which is red, and urn B contains 100 marbles, of which 8 are red. So the odds of winning in the first urn are 10%, and the odds of winning in the second are only 8%. So it seems like it would be pretty obvious. I would prefer to draw a marble from the one that's more likely to win. It seems like making the right choice should be easy, but it is not. About 30 to 40% of college students chose the urn with the larger number of winning marbles rather than the urn that provides a better chance of winning. So literally just seeing more marbles, 8 rather than 1, influence people to make an irrational choice. We often make many of our choices based off nothing more than what is currently in front of us and filling our senses and stirring our intuitions. What's really scary is that Kahneman notes, you will often find that knowing little makes it easier to fit everything you know into a coherent pattern. I'm sure most of you probably went, oh, I know some people like that. When the narrative in our mind, the story we've constructed in our subconscious, feels threatened, a reaction occurs. If you've ever had someone bluntly challenge a view that you hold dear with a piece of evidence you had no idea how to respond to, you probably got a sick feeling in the pit of your stomach, and you may have felt yourself getting heated and anxious. The internal reaction that produces this type of defensiveness is called cognitive dissonance in psychology. Cognitive dissonance is what happens when a person tries to believe or is forced to risk believing two contradictory things at the same time. When a person has become comfortable with what they believe, and even more so when they feel they can achieve their desires through those beliefs, their research is more often about seeking affirmation than it is about asking if there is truth to any other view. This study, to me, is one of the most impactful. Social psychologist Tim Gilovich has found that when we want to believe something, we ask ourselves, can I believe it? Then we search for supporting evidence, and if we can find even a single piece of pseudo-evidence, we can stop thinking. We now have permission to believe. We have a justification in case anyone asks. In contrast, when we don't want to believe something, we ask ourselves, must I believe it? Then we search for contrary evidence, and if we find a single reason to doubt the claim, we can dismiss it. When subjects were told that an intelligence test gave them a low score, they chose to read articles criticizing rather than supporting the validity of IQ tests. When subjects were asked to lick a strip of paper to determine whether they had a serious enzyme deficiency, people waited longer for the paper to change color when a color change is desirable than when it indicated a problem. And those who got the undesirable diagnosis found more reasons why the test might not be accurate. For example, my mouth was unusually dry today. Part of the problem is everything in the world has room for doubt, and it takes very little work to find a theoretical reason to doubt a piece of evidence. Thus, if we don't want to believe something, we won't. Researcher David Perkins brought people across ages and education levels into his lab and asked them about social issues, such as whether giving schools more money would improve the quality of teaching and learning. After they wrote down their view, he would ask them for arguments both for and against their view. People would come up with significantly more my side arguments than they would for the other side, regardless of what their view was. However, he found that people with higher education and higher IQ levels were better at finding more arguments for their own side, but they showed no difference in finding arguments for the other side. Perkins concluded that people invest their IQs in buttressing their own case rather than in exploring the entire issue more fully and even-handedly. Researcher Deanna Kuhn sums up this behavior as, here is some evidence I can point to as supporting my theory, and therefore I'm right. Haidt labels his own behavior as, reject first, ask rhetorical questions later. Kahneman adds that when you believe a conclusion is true, it's also very likely that you will believe arguments that appear to support it, even when those arguments are unsound. One example I often give is conservative Christians and the history of Christianity. When conservatives discuss politics, I often hear them complain about how little the youth of today know about the history of their country. Yet if you ask them about the history of Christianity, the people making this complaint often know very little. If you ask them whether their faith flows from their politics or their politics flows from their faith, they will always say that their faith is where they get their political views. And yet they generally know as little about the history of their own faith, such as who picked which books would be in the Bible, as the current generation knows about what is in the Constitution and why. If you start bringing these things up to them, voice of experience, and they in any way challenge the views held by the person, they get very uncomfortable and will quickly throw out a reason why they should be able to safely ignore your statements, usually without any thought of researching if there was any truth to the claim you made. In general, we are much more concerned about confirmation bias, meaning proving our own views to ourselves and others, than we are about if our views are actually true. This isn't correlated with any political view, but simply with being human. If most of the time we are seeking to avoid cognitive dissonance, the frustration of trying to believe two contrasting and conflicting things, then what we are seeking most often is what Kahneman calls cognitive ease. When our subconscious can weave our lives into a grand narrative, when it feels as if there are no loose ends for the ideas in our heads, then we can maintain the peace of self-satisfaction. One of the particular ways we are susceptible to bias is simply repetition. When we hear something often enough, we start to believe it's true. Kahneman says anything that makes it easier for the associative machine in the subconscious to run smoothly will also bias beliefs. A reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition, because familiarity is not easily distinguished from truth. Authoritarian institutions and marketers have always known this fact. Additionally, it has been found that familiarity and repetition will give things favor with us, not just belief. Both Kahneman and Haidt bring up a study by Robert Zients in their books where people were given Japanese words, made up words, and geometric shapes and asked to rate them. Zients was able to make people like any word or image more and give it a higher rating just by showing it to them several times, even when they didn't realize that they'd already rated it lower earlier in the test. The brain tags familiar things as good things. Zients called this the mere exposure effect, and it's a basic principle of advertising. Studies have also shown that attractiveness biases us, that first impressions are incredibly important, that stinky smells and washed hands will make us vote more moralistically, that seeing pictures of eyes watching us will make us behave more responsibly, and that bad font, questions written in a poor font, will help us answer questions correctly because it frustrates our intuition, which triggers the analytical mind and thus causes more critical thinking. Think about that. A frustrating font makes you critical think better, so you're more likely to answer problems correctly. Kahneman sums up the issues here well when he says, how do you know that a statement is true? If the statement is strongly linked by logic or association to other beliefs, or preferences you hold, or comes from a source you like, you will feel a sense of cognitive ease. And there may be other causes for your feeling of ease, including the quality of the font. And you have no simple way of tracing your feelings to their source. Kahneman then adds, we find ourselves liking or disliking something the instant we notice it, sometimes before we even know what it is. As psychologist William James said, a great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging their prejudices. If we think that a majority of our decisions and thoughts come about by rationality, we are deceiving ourselves. Sadly, the most intelligent people find this lie the easiest to believe because they can come up with so many justifications for their intuitive impulses using their analytical mind. We often think that people take in information, categorize it, and then react, but it seems exactly the opposite is the case. Even what we call emotions, in reality, are incredibly complex and rich intuitions, which is why they require some forms of processing such as writing and talking about them. Haidt says emotions are a kind of information processing. Thus, contrasting emotions with thinking is therefore as pointless as contrasting rain with weather or cars with vehicles. Haidt notes that we can have multiple intuitions arising simultaneously, each one processing a different kind of information, all at the same time. The idea that rationality and emotions are two opposed forces in our mind has been a helpful oversimplification in the past, but it's not true. As the mathematician and physicist Blaise Pascal said with positivity, the heart has reasons which the reason cannot understand. Kahneman says, we no longer think of the mind as going through a sequence of conscious ideas one at a time. In the current view of how associative memory works, a great deal happens at once. An idea that has been activated does not merely evoke one other idea. It activates many ideas, which in turn activate many others. Furthermore, only a few of these activated ideas will register in the conscious analytical mind. Most of the work of associative thinking is silent, hidden from our conscious selves. The notion that we have limited access to the working of our minds is difficult to accept, naturally, because it's alien to our experience. But it is true. You know far less about yourself than you think you do. The point of this long first section is to help us understand that truth is not as easily accessible to us as we think it is, and likely it will always take serious effort and help to find truth. I also hope what I've discussed will lay a foundation of humility and compassion when we encounter people with different belief systems than our own, as it's not any more easy for them to overcome the function of their minds than it is for us. Personality, as I am using the word here, is the different ways our mind functions that are not necessarily good or bad, but are simply neutral. Some systems, like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, for those of you that have heard of ENFP, ISTJ, were based on a single person's theories about what made up the personality, and afterwards they were tested for. However, a system from the 60s that is much more scientifically rooted is the Big Five system. It has been verified by many researchers, and the main way its 5 personality traits were decided was by creating a questionnaire with thousands of self-descriptions, such as if you were organized or if you liked being social. And then thousands of people were asked to rate how accurately these statements applied to them. The researchers then measured what descriptions were always occurring together in people's answers, and they named the 5 clusters of answers that kept showing up together. These traits became the Big Five. Thus, these 5 traits were allowed to rise naturally from thousands of people rather than from one researcher's opinions. I'll only be covering the 2 immediately relevant traits of the 5, but I have a feeling that as I read some of their attributes, their relevance will become obvious. Conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is a tendency to display self-discipline, to act dutifully, and to strive for achievement against measures or outside expectations. It is related to the way in which people control, regulate, and direct their impulses. High scores on conscientiousness indicate a preference for planned rather than spontaneous behavior. Those high in conscientiousness are sensitive to perceived threats, and they tend to experience an increased level of the emotion disgust. They tend to emphasize personal responsibility. The second trait I want to talk about is called openness. Openness is a general appreciation for art, emotion, adventure, unusual ideas, imagination, curiosity, and variety of experience. People who are open to experience are intellectually curious, open to emotion, sensitive to beauty, and willing to try new things. They tend to be, when compared to closed people, more creative and more aware of their feelings. Those high in openness crave diversity, variety, and stimulation. They tend to emphasize accommodating to the complexity of people's circumstances. You might call that compassion. While the Big Five has been around since the 60s, it wasn't popular or respected until the 80s and 90s, and only recently have people started studying the correlations between these two attributes and political views. What they've found is that they are highly correlated. You can test people for these traits, and then you can ask them separately what their political views are, and very often they come together. They come at the same time. There are many other elements, even in neurobiology and genetics, that corroborate these findings. Here's a quote from Jonathan Haidt on the subject. After analyzing the DNA of 13,000 Australians, scientists recently found several genes that differed between liberals and conservatives, most of them related to neurotransmitter functioning, particularly glutamate and serotonin, both of which are involved in the brain's response to threats and fear. This finding fits well with many studies showing that conservatives react more strongly than liberals to signs of danger, including the threat of germs and contamination, and even low-level threats such as sudden blasts of white noise. Other studies have implicated genes related to receptors for the neurotransmitter dopamine, which has long been tied to sensation-seeking and openness to experience, which are among the best established correlations with liberalism. As the Renaissance writer Michael de Montaigne said, "The only things I find rewarding are variety and enjoyment of diversity." So think about, these could be called stereotypes, but I think there's some truth to them that are helpful. Think about how often conservatives and veterans are in the military, and the correlation with conscientiousness and a defense against perceived threats. And now think about some of the stereotype hippies of the 60s and 70s, their interest in drugs, their interest in social movements, and look at the desire for a variety of experience and an accommodation to the complexity of people's circumstances. This sort of research has tremendous implications. While people will sometimes casually say, "Oh, I think we're all right," when it comes to issues like politics, there's now strong evidence that this might be exactly the case. When I see politicians, activists, or even parents focus solely on one of these traits, the policies and parenting that come out don't seem to go so well. All responsibility and no compassion produces broken and unhealthy people. But all compassion and no responsibility, which I wouldn't call compassion anyways, creates a different kind of dysfunction. Councils of cautious and open people working together can hear arguments from both sides of an issue and produce balanced and wise results. Psychologist Jordan Peterson has done a variety of research on these two traits and their practical effects in society, both politically and otherwise. He's noted that innovative businesses and bold ventures are more often started by people high in openness, and then people high in conscientiousness often come along to maintain the business because that's where their strengths lie. Peterson disagrees with parents who mock or criticize their children for becoming artists because those artists, who are often high in openness, are the ones that produce the higher-end art that rich people spend their money on. They are the ones who boost economies after more basic needs are met. Conscientiousness is often treated as more prosperous, but truly wealthy economies are pushed to such levels with the help of people high in openness. In the first section of my talk, I argued that our views, especially political, are not as obvious as we think they are. I hope in this section to have opened up the possibility in your mind that the two sides of the political spectrum may be two halves of the same coin. I'm going to give more examples of this, but I've got one more thing to discuss that I think is key to the whole conversation.